So I meant to tell you, I'm done with wetsuit season. I'm done. That's it. We're recording this at the very, very end of October. This episode's coming out the very beginning of November. I'm done. I'm not gonna push it this year. I just don't feel like it. I've been sick a lot. You're probably hearing my voice a little bit. People are listening to it.
Yeah, it's I always fight with it in my head towards the end of the season. I was just out in the wetsuit the other night, and it was the first night where I said, holy crap, is it cold? Like, this isn't smart. And I was having the conversation. I bumped into a guy that I know at the spot, so there was nothing going on. So we literally talked more than we fished. And he's like, this is my last. He's like, this is my last outing in the suit. And I was like, I always want it to be in a way, because I know it's so much more comfortable, obviously, in the waders at the end of the year. But I have two spots in particular that can be fished in waders fine and a dry top, but I just feel like I'm handicapped. Like, I can't quite get to that rock that I always fish off of. And I always have in the back of my mind too, like that safety aspect, especially when it's that cold.
Yes.
That if I tried and I pushed it just a hair too much and something went wrong, like, I just say screw it, and I suffer through it, but I always have this thought too, like when I'm out, I'm like, dude, you should have thrown some like warm water in a thermos, so when you get back to the truck, you can pour it in the suit and have like a quick shot of heat. I don't know if it would actually be a smart thing or a bad thing.
You're pouring it over your head.
Yeah, anything. Because you figure when you get in the truck or your car or whatever, you're on the way back, you're blasting that heat, and it's not going through the suit if you leave it on. Like, no. I leave my suit for the ride home. So I'm thinking that hot shot of water, I don't know, maybe I'll try that, or,
It's not a bad idea, because I definitely remember times like getting back to the buggy and literally just dropping everything and getting in, and then just sitting there as all the windows completely fog up for a half an hour, because I can't even function to get out of my suit, because I have to drive further, right? So most of my places. And so I'm sitting there trying to get warmed up because I can't even function. If you had some kind of, jump start, that would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny.
I just don't know. I'd have to be careful, because you don't want it to be too hot where you like shock your system. And probably at that point, 60-degree water going in would probably feel warm. Maybe I'll try it.
I feel like somebody should send us a video of them doing that. We'll post it on our social. Like that's something, that's a challenge. Like, somebody do that and let's see if we can get it on our social, because that's hilarious. That is too funny. I want to see the air temperature be in the 30s and you dumping your thermos down your wetsuit. That's the challenge. All right.
But not too hot, because I don't want anybody getting burnt.
Yeah. Don't burn yourself. We're not taking any culpability for this. This is your own decision.
Or if you have a better idea.
Or if you have a better idea.
Yeah, we'll take that too.
Yeah. So today, Toby, we haven't done a structure or a kind of surf spot talk for a while now. So today we're gonna talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, especially in the fall, especially in the month of October, which we're actually getting out of, but into November. And that's the idea of a tabletop sandbar. Now, a tabletop sandbar, it's not, I don't know if that's whatever people use for the name, but that's what I use the name for. And it's not something I hear getting talked about very much. When we hear about sandbars, it's those long bars that extend along the beach, or like the finger type that reach out from the beach at an angle. Mm-hmm. But a tabletop bar for me is a small, relatively small. It could be, 50, 80 yards. But they're usually a lot smaller than that though. A small rectangular or square bar that's not a hump. A hump has like a dome to it, but they're flat on top, just like a sandbar, but they're small and they're isolated. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about them. And they can be a really fun thing to fish that takes some very specific tactics, but also reaps some very specific rewards because of its shape. So my first question to you is, because I wanted to do this live, is what's your thoughts on that, and have you experienced that very much?
It's, as you're describing it, I'm thinking initially, oh yeah, like a sandbar. I'm thinking that this is just your regular old sandbar coming off the beach or running parallel, for hopefully hundreds of yards. And then as you described it, I'm like, I don't know if I've ever actually run into it knowingly. Like, maybe I've gotten, I've come across it and it's been there, but so it actually, it as I think of that, perhaps I've never run into this or ran into it and didn't realize it, my immediate question is, how do you know that's what it is? Like, how did you ID it to start?
That's a great question. So for me, it's really a couple of specific spots, and oftentimes one of them in particular, I can wade out to it. So I can either wade out to it, or at low tide they're exposed, and so I can literally see them. So if I'm going in this one spot in particular, I always go and check it at low tide because it can be so tricky to find the structure because there's not always like big ripping waves and stuff. So I'll go and actually look at it. But on nights that you're looking for it, I mean, obviously in the day, you probably can see it a little better, but I'm fishing at night on these things. On the night you're looking for it, it usually almost looks like a point or a hump where you're going to get a rolling wave that comes in out of nowhere. Even in the smallest little bit of surf, you're going to get that lift and that hump that comes up over the top of it. The big difference is oftentimes with these things, it's very small and short, and it completely disappears before it ever even gets close to the beach. You know, on a sandbar, you might get the big wave that rocks up over the top of it, breaks, it waves, it rolls into the trough, it picks up again, and it comes in. I don't usually see that with these things. So it's normally a little bit more contracted, but honestly, I mean, going at low tide and looking for them is really the way to do it. But again, they're not a hump. These tabletop bars, as I call them, they have a very hard edge. So it's like they're like a normal sandbar where you're walking along and then all of a sudden you're banging into them with your knees or your quads, right? You're hitting them with your thighs. They're a real hard edge. And I think that's really important for how to fish them. So does that make sense? I mean, that's how I usually find them.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I even like knowing that I don't, my sand beach time spent on sand beaches is much smaller than rocky, but I can't even recall a scenario where, hey, maybe that's what that was, or I ran into. So maybe I fished one unknowingly, but I don't think so. So this is going to be just as much a learning experience for me to look for, and then when I encounter one as the listeners today. So I like that.
Well, great. So then I'm going to learn too, because I'm probably going to ask you some questions to get your opinion and your advice maybe on how I approach them, just based on how I approach them and maybe what you would do differently. So the big thing to know about these tabletop bars for me is they work with a variety of baits, or when there's quote unquote no bait. So the fish are more oriented to the structure or the water movement. But really often for me in the fall, they're very sand eel oriented. So there's lots of sand eels. The sand eels love that tabletop because think about it, it's an island. So they can get up on top of that bar in that little zone and stay out of all the deeper water that's all around it. So they tend to collect on it, I think. So, whether it's 3 inches or 3 feet, I find that the sand eels are really concentrated up on top, to the point sometimes when I can get on top of them and I'll be walking out to them and there'll be a sand eel here and some spearing maybe or something, or I'll spook something weird. But when I get on top of them, it's like they're just shooting out everywhere, shooting all around my feet. So I think that's really important. The other thing to know, and I've heard from a few guys on Long Island actually, where these tabletop bars are usually signifies something is very different. So there's some kind of change in current. So in my seminars, I tell people all the time, you're looking for increase, decrease, or change in direction of current. You're always looking for something different. But the current, the velocity or the direction, is a real feeding advantage. And so something about what's happening with the water right there is creating this little microcosm. It's creating this little tabletop bar. And so a lot of times, in conjunction with the sand eels accumulating on top, the shallow water, which creates the wave action, which the stripers obviously love, you've also got some kind of movement around this thing, all around it. And it really depends on what's happening with the environmental conditions. So you actually get an interaction potentially between wind, wave, and tidal current. So the tidal current can be moving, left or right, or maybe it's slightly an angle to it. And then you have the wind, which can be going, at any angle to it. And then you can have the waves, which might actually be a little bit different than the wind, because they may actually be driven by tide and wind, or actually, if it's a storm, they could be completely different. So you've got this little island, this little square. And I really like to think about it in quadrants. So for example, if I'm fishing a right to left current, okay, and I'm looking at this tabletop bar, well, in a lot of spots, I want to fish the head of the current. So I want to fish up current, so I would fish the right side. In this particular case, I want to fish the down current side because I want to get those sand eels as they're getting washed off. Okay? So the striper's going to associate that left side. Okay, that's not very advanced. I feel like a lot of people would, know to potentially try this. But the thing is, now think about if you've got a wind that's coming in from like your 2 o'clock and the waves are coming kind of across that tabletop. Now I want to fish that inside corner, that inside left corner, because I've got the current pushing across and I've got the waves pushing and winds pushing in. So now those striples will really associate with that inside corner. They won't be at the beach lift. They won't be beach lip, They won't be in the trough. They're going to be at that corner in this little cone. And yes, they will absolutely push up on top of the tabletop all the time. I have that happen all the time. But the thing that's really interesting about these tabletops is you get those 4 quadrants, those 4 corners. And depending on where and what's happening with water movement and wind and waves, they can move around those different sides. And unlike a long sandbar, you're not sort of dependent on just one condition. Oh, on the dropping tide, the current's a lot stronger, so they come in the trough. Or, oh, I really need the wind in my face to create the white water to come over the bar. You could kind of fish these things in a circle as long as the sand eels are there. And again, this comes back to why I like the sand eels, because once they're there, they tend to be there for weeks on end. So that's the beginnings. So does that make sense? Would you approach it that way? Would you fish that bottom quadrant, or would you sort of look around in a different way?
So no, I think I'm thinking it through, because I'm my starting point would be how I would approach sort of the end of your traditional sandbar, so because in that case I've got I've got 3/4 of it there, just that whatever side isn't cut off yet. And generally when I start fishing a sandbar when I'm fishing the bar itself, not the trough, not my approaching casts to it, I sort of go to the edges of it and I fish, in perfect world I go right to the end of it and start on the far, if you're looking out and it's going right to left and then the deep water's in front of me going to the left, I'd cast out and fish it down into it. That's where I would start. I might fish my way to it if I have to walk to it or something, but if I can just go and start right on it, I'd basically be fishing that drop off side of it to begin with. And then I guess similarly, you're saying where it concentrates, if you've got the current going and the wind and wave activity, kind of pushing to that corner, I could see myself migrating to that as like the quick secondary spot to go to, because again, it's that funnel point, that concentrating the variables in front of you. And you can generally with these, at least, the larger ones, you can see it. So it's an easy focal point for me, because I like to, when I fish anything, whether it's sand or rock or rip, I try to break it down into pieces.
That's right.
And fish this little section here and then this section. So the more visual I have, even at night, because even in the darkest of nights, we can see that wave activity at least. It's easier to reference off of. I know, hey, these last couple of casts I've been right here, nothing happened. Well, now I can aim a little left. So I would start working on it. It's going to draw my attention. It's going to draw my eyes. So I could certainly see working through it in that same manner as you're describing.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. When you're casting your plug, which we'll talk about what we use in a second, I'll ask you what you think you'd like to use, and I'll tell you what I use most of the time. When you're casting, and let's say you got this situation that I just detailed, where you got right to left movement, and you've got like is that called a quartering wind, I guess, where it's coming at you from your 2 o'clock?
Yeah.
Sort of, yeah.
That's what I call it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, how professional of us. Where are you going to cast to? Where are you going to put that first cast?
I don't find, for the most part, that my success comes on tops of sandbars. Okay. So I try to land on the sandbar, but close enough to the edge that I'm trying to focus on that cast with, so that I have bite with whatever the lure is, come tight, I can sort of balance and catch up to things. So I don't want to hit right where I want to fish. I sort of want to swim it into it, coming tight, getting a good feel, and then going into that almost, and I'm trying to, I guess, replicate a naturally distressed bait fish or sand eel or something getting pushed off, because I've found, for me, more often it's that edge. It's right at the edge where those fish are, and it's like, I envision they're sitting there, they're kind of looking up, or they're patrolling up and down that edge, and as they see something come over, they hit it. Whereas in my experiences, on the tops when you get the fish, it's like the smaller ones. Like the little rats are like the scouts running around looking for bait on the top, but the better fish I find are in that opportunistic feeding mode. They're not expending the energy of fighting the shallower water. They're waiting for that food to come in their face, and then they jump on it. So that's where I'd be. Close enough to the edge at the point that I'm trying to cover where I can bring it in pretty quickly. And I'm also wasting less time in my mind.
Yeah.
Not dragging it across less productive potential water.
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, so if I'm fishing that quadrant, I want the key thing you said, though, is that you want it to, well, at least what I like to do, I want it to land on the bar. I want it to land on the tabletop. Let's stop calling it the bar. Land on the tabletop. Because by the time I connect and everything gets lined up, which you actually also said, I want it to be just swimming enough where it's not digging in, so when it comes over the top, everything is normal. Whether that's a swing, whether that's a swim, whether that's a jerk, whether it's a drop, whether it's a whatever it is, I want it to be all perfectly lined up. So it's not even so much about letting it sweep off in this particular case. It's more about getting it all set up so that when it comes off, it's all set for to look natural. So that's something I think that a lot of anglers who are using something that digs deep, a bottle plug, an SP minnow, a heavier bucktail, they're going to be hesitant to cast it onto the bar because it's going to drag, and then when it drags, it comes off, and it catches up and starts swimming. You don't want it to drag at the beginning. You want it to come off already, working. Mm-hmm. The big key for me to do this a lot of times, and this is something I see anglers do wrong all the time in the few times I'm around other anglers, you don't want to walk up to the piece of structure and orient yourself straight up and down to it. So in this particular case, if we're fishing that lower left-hand quadrant, for example, I'm going to move far left, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast up towards, not far left. I'm going to not completely line myself up in what the waves are doing all the way to shore. I'm going to be a little bit to the right of that. But I'm going to cast up onto the tabletop, right? And I'm going to pull it towards me with the current. That also helps it prevent it from digging in and dragging or whatever. But you're naturally helping the progression of the lure. And that, I think, is really key. And this is an absolute tip for all kinds of structure. And this is something that so many anglers do wrong. Oh, look, the waves are right here in front of me. Oh, look, the boulder's right here in front of me. Oh, look, the rip line is in front of me. I'm going to line myself up directly in front of it and cast out at it. That's the wrong take on it. And there's a million different takes of what you should do based on the spot and the structure. But in this particular case, I would slide what would be down current in this particular case so that I could drop it into that. Now, that's not the only way to fish this. We don't have time to talk about all the millions of different ways you can approach this. But that's definitely one of the top ways to approach it. And that's because in these particular cases, I'm super reliant on 3 plugs. And one's a weird one. And then I'm going to ask you what you might use. Okay. So the 3 plugs that I'm really relying on are Sluggos on a jig head. Usually on the smaller side, 7.5 inch, maybe 6. But that's, I feel weird about fishing 6 inches. In the surf. It's very small. It works really well, and I've had some what I call micro bites where these fish to like 20 pounds are taking these little tiny soft plastics. It's so fun. Your teaser fishing without teasers. Yeah. But the 7.5 is really my favorite. 3/8, half ounce, maybe 3/4, but usually not. Or a needlefish. Pick your poison. Not a super strike usually because it's a little heavy, but depending on if you're punching it into, let's say the wind's pretty strong coming across that quadrant. Punch it, got to get connected. You might be using a heavy super strike. You might be using red eye. So, I mean, it just depends. And then the final one, and this is sort of a late season sand eel thing in general. I have these really small metal lips. I have a little surf stir. I've got some small versions of hookers and stuff. They don't look anything like a sand eel. They don't act anything like a sand eel. But for some reason, those freaking fish respond to them when they're in these situations. And so I'll put them out there over the top and I'll get it swimming, and I think it's just because it swims real nice and it comes over the top and it looks weak and they just hammer it. So those are my 3 plugs I carry a plug bag absolutely jam-packed with plugs, but those are the 3 that I feel like I would be lost without. So what do you think? What would you do?
So my approach, and I'm just going to stick to artificials because I won't even get into eel potential, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But I would probably start with a needlefish of some sort. would be the first thing, because I feel I can, castability and able to really prospect the depth to see how sharp is the edge, how deep is the drop, how shallow is the top of the tabletop, etc. I'll probably take a couple of casts, obviously hoping I catch something, but I would sort of prospect with that and then go into some sort of plastic lipped swimmer, like a Finnish swimmer, a Rebel, Bomber, what is it, the Yozuri Hydroma, something to that effect, because now I would have a better idea of what I'm casting. And the reason I would kind of take that 1-2 step on it is because so many times, and again, I'm comparing it to fishing my normal sandbars versus the tabletop.
Totally.
I would assume that it was 4 feet deep on top and the edges are deep, and I'd put whatever it is, an SP minnow on, and it would dig right in, and too quickly I'm sort of wasting time, and I don't feel like I'm approaching it properly. Whereas at least on my prospecting with a needlefish, maybe I'll catch a fish or two while I'm figuring it out.
Yeah.
And then then from there I can adjust to, do I need a deeper diving plastic, a shallower running, or whatever the case may be. So those would be my first two. Then traditionally it would have been some sort of an eel replicating thing, like a big slug, like the 12-inch sluggo or the GT eel or the Block Island eel, something like that. But having fished more time with you now, before I would go there, I would actually go for swimming a 9-inch sluggo across it before I would probably jump up to that 13-inch range eel replica. I always wanted to fish that kind of stuff more when I heavily fished sand beaches, but again, that was 20 years ago when I was regularly fishing it. So yeah, there was a 9-inch sluggo and things like that, but they didn't have the same application. We just weren't fishing them the same way. So like, you've influenced me positively in that manner, where I brought it into my rotation in a lot of places, but I would be like, yes, I can finally fish this here now.
Yeah. They're really magical in this particular case. And you definitely hit on something that is a close runner-up. I mean, frankly, the little metal lips, I'm doing a little bit for the podcast because it's so interesting and fun and maybe something you hadn't heard of. But honestly, a redfin's going to be in my bag. It has to be. And I will have a weightless one. Yes, people, weightless. They work really, really well in this case if you can cast them. And I'll be honest, late in the season, if I find this situation and I'm like, I want to get that weightless friggin' redfin out there, or my little sluggo, I might go down to 20-pound braid. I might be using 20-pound braid and a 9.5 foot stick, something that really punches those things, and just hoping for the best. I mean, look, guys landed massive fish on 17-pound mono forever, so you just got to be careful and hope for the best. Unfortunately, 1 November, I lost 2 massive fish in 2 nights in a row. And one night I was using 20 and it broke. The next night I wasn't, and I lost it anyways. But that was because it was shad. So there was shad mixed in with the schoolies and slot fish up to 20 pounds, because they're doing the same thing. They're also feeding on those sand eels. And I lost on a freestyler, for people who listen to me all the time, this Savage Gear, and the other one was actually on an old Gags needlefish. But I really believe in that weightless redfin for this case too, because think about it, you put it on top of that, let's say the top of that tabletop, even at high tide, it's 1.5 foot or 2 feet. That redfin is going to be right on top. It's going to look perfect. You're going to be pulling it right over. It's going to be wagging like crazy, and you can almost hang it right on that spot. So it works really well. So
yeah. What was the little metal lip your surprising one? Because I have a little. If not, it's probably the same as what I'm thinking as my last level of prospecting it, but I'll let you see. I'll see if what you were thinking there was what you said, or if there's another one.
What do you mean?
Another plug that you would add. So you've gone through that little selection of 3.
Oh.
Is that it? Because I've got a 4th that would be in my bag that I would use to prospect this scenario.
So I'm going to carry a whole bunch of stuff to try, but those are the bread and butter. So please, what will be your 4th?
It's and I know it's something you fish on the sand that's not a traditional sand. That's why I wasn't sure if it was what you're getting at. But the darter, like you had kind of said but in that, when I throw the dart, especially on the shallower bars, shallower tops, I'll actually try to work them right down the edge, whether it's I'm at the end and I'm working, straight out for me, so it's working right down the edge. I don't know if I'm sort of replicating a small a bass. They might think, the bigger bass thinks it's a small bass in the feeding lane, or they think it's a porgy or a shad or whatever the case, kind of running that edge. But I do like to add that in. It's never the first thing I'm going, but it's in the rotation that when I've cycled through, whether I'm catching or not, it'll go in that kind of an idea. I like it when I can really figure out where the edges are, that sharp drop, and work that edge with it.
So what's really interesting, and maybe this is a great place to stop, is I always carry Super Strike Darter. And actually on these bites in the past, I've carried all kinds of different sizes of darters, usually going smaller. So I'm starting to carry smaller stuff. And all of the nights that I've fished on these, and, there's been, 2 nights in a row and I'll catch 120 fish, or, one night I catch 70, or, there's been plenty of those on this particular situation. That's why I'm bringing it up, because I love it so much. And I never hear it talked about. I don't think I have caught more than a half dozen fish on a darter in this particular case. And I don't know if that's because it's so spot specific, and maybe, this is a spot specific thing. If it's because I'm so biased because the other things work so well, I still bring it every single friggin' time, because I'm not going to not bring it. But I think it's sort of that delivery method where most of the time I'm sweeping off and I'm not pulling against. And that's maybe why. That's probably why. So in closing, though, you talking just Super Strike, or are you talking other kinds of darters?
It's going to be the Super Strike, just because, again, in that scenario, I actually want it to get down a little bit more. So I've got the ones that I rig to dive a little bit deeper, and they're going to hold in the melee. Hopefully there's some whitewater, etc. So it's not it's a heavy weighted rigging to get down a bit. I'm sure I could play around with other darters that are out there that would certainly do it, but when I've got it already figured out to do exactly what I want there, that ends up being the Super Strike.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're still fishing for the rest of the fall, especially you guys Long Island, New Jersey, you're just getting warmed up, some of you, I would keep an eye out for the tabletop bar. Don't treat it like the other bars that you've been fishing, and hopefully this will help you catch some more fish this fall. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, at the Surfcast Podcast.